In this unit, we will be discussing the two domains in which we live, work, and function. These are space and place. And it's important to make this distinction between these two because we approach life in each one a little bit differently. So we can think about cyberspace as a conceptual domain within which internet interactions take place. So it's harder to pinpoint what cyberspace looks like, which we'll refer back to a little bit later, and just think about the fact that it is a domain, it is somewhere that we go, but there's no real where to it. There's no physical location for cyberspace. So this is called cyberspace and not cyberplace because when we think of places, we use places to refer to physical settings. Whereas space refers to, instead of a physical area, it refers to a virtual area. So for the duration of this course, when we're talking about places, we're talking about physical locations. When we're talking about spaces, we're talking about still locations, but virtual locations. So let's explore the idea of virtual versus physical locations. One question we can ask ourselves is cyberspace rendering place irrelevant? And I don't think it is because we are still living in places. We're still physically located somewhere, but the boundaries are a little more blurred now than they have been in the past. So think about your virtual life versus your physical life and what are the differences. And by taking this class online, it's really interesting when you think about the differences between your experience of this class versus your experience of this class had you taken it in a traditional classroom setting. So think about, how does this class function differently? Well, you're probably in a place that's more familiar to you or a location that's more familiar to you. You're alone, so even though you can participate in discussions with people, that is asynchronous communication. We have very little nonverbal feedback between each other. If you use a smiley or an exclamation point, then I can get the nonverbal feedback from you in an email or in a discussion post. But I can't look for eye contact. I can't look for whether you look to be bored or fidgeting while I'm doing these lectures. I can see that in a physical classroom, but I can't in a virtual classroom. And our interactions are limited, again, to asynchronous, so you can't ask me a question right in the middle of this lecture right now and have me respond. So we lose some spontaneity as well. But one other thing that people would like to think about outside of the education setting with virtual versus physical is, does the virtual life actually count? Or is it like Vegas? What happens in cyberspace stays in cyberspace. So it's interesting to see how we perceive the virtual world and the physical world differently, and yet even amongst us there are different perceptions. Some people thinking that virtual life doesn't count because there's no actual physical interaction in that. So when we think about virtual versus physical and the way we evaluate copies of certain things, it becomes a little bit murkier. There is a difference in the way we evaluate virtual copies of music versus physical copies of music. And so from the survey that you filled out prior to this unit, we found out that many people have downloaded music without paying for it, but haven't stolen a physical CD from a store. Even though you experience those in the same way and they're the same information digitally, because we live in the electronic culture now where we can reproduce things digitally without loss, interestingly enough, we still see a difference, or many of us at least, still see a difference between virtual and physical. If we can't reach out and touch it, then it's not stealing it. So the question to ask for us as communication students is, does this difference extend past objects and representations of objects and apply also to personal relationships? So thinking about the personal relationships that we have, do those differ if they were only virtual relationships? Obviously, we have many relationships that we meet people physically and then we carry on relationships through Facebook or through other communication technologies. But what about people that we know only virtually? Are those relationships different? So once we start thinking about the people that we interact with and the relationships we have, we can start to think of the notion of the community in which we work, live, or interact virtually. So some adjectives that you can think of when you think of the word community are togetherness, interaction, bond. But what is a community for our purposes? Well, let's go ahead and define what creates or sustains a community. And if you think about what creates or sustains a community, you can look at the word community and realize there's something that's near and dear to us all in that, and that is communication. Can a community survive without communication? No, a community cannot survive without communication, not in our current electronic culture. So let's think about, what does a community mean? Can a community be both virtual and in physical space? Well, by our definition of community, we can have a group of people who live in the same locality and under the same government. So for instance, the Bloomington Normal community. But community is more than just that. It can also be a group of people who have common interests. So the scientific community can be people who have interest in scientific related topics. But a community can also be a distinct segment of society, such as the gay community. Now, are these things all bound by physical location? No, they're not. So let's think about the differences between a physical community and a virtual community. In a physical community, we usually have people in the same geographic area, like Bloomington Normal. Physical communities are usually fairly homogeneous. The people are fairly similar within those communities. And we usually interact in a synchronous fashion in a physical community. Now in a virtual, we usually have members more dispersed, if we're primarily a virtual community. More heterogeneity also exists because you're able to get people from different places that are able to interact in a similar space or in a shared space, but they're in different places, so they have different physical backgrounds. Also, there's more asynchronous interaction virtually. While we could be chatting in real time, there are still some limitations in technology to have an online virtual community where everyone participates in the same way that you can cram 20 people in a room and teach to them. It has to operate in a little bit different fashion. So in terms of community, it's more about our state of mind than it is about our physical location. And if we can think of state of mind and how it pertains to space versus place, whether you're alone or not can be in your mind, not in your physical or virtual setting. So think about, as I asked on the questionnaire, if you've ever been at home alone, but you've been online talking to someone or talking to someone on the phone, and you weren't feeling lonely even though you were physically alone, whereas maybe you were in a large group of people in a new setting and didn't know anybody and felt kind of lonely, maybe on your first day of college classes. So as we think about the state of mind, let's think about the internet is to the brain as cyberspace is to the mind. So the internet is the physical manifestation, like the brain is, and we can see about how much a brain weighs and see what a brain looks like if we look into textbooks, but we can't see the mind. We know what's in our mind. We know that we have minds and we're able to think and process this class, but we can't wrap our brains around our mind, so to speak. We can't figure out what our mind looks like physically, just like cyberspace. However, I'm going to give you a task to perform. I'm going to ask you to create a map of cyberspace. So think about how you would describe cyberspace or how you would actually draw out cyberspace. Using any kind of computer technology you have available to you, you can either narrate what you think cyberspace would look like, or you can create a drawing using any kind of computer drawing programs or anything that you want to draw and scan in. Either way, that'll fulfill the assignment. But look later in this unit for that assignment and be thinking from here until you do that, what would cyberspace look like? How do I perceive it physically, even though it's a virtual space?